All right, so today's topic is updating your town plan for forest integrity. Act 171 is the piece of legislation here that we're going to be diving into. And if you're just getting on the line right now, I'm Andy Wood, and Jens Hilke will be coming in later in the presentation to wrap things up. We're at the Community Wildlife Program at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we're really pleased to have you here today and excited to share this topic. We've done this webinar a couple times before this fall, and after today, we're going to do it once more again in December. So if you like what you see and there are other folks in your network who you think would benefit from seeing this webinar, just they can get in touch with us. I'll put the emails at the end of the PowerPoint, and know that also we are recording this. So if you need to hop off the line for any reason, we can make that recording available to you later. Just a couple notes here for housekeeping. We're on Microsoft Teams. This is pretty similar to Zoom. You should have the ability to toggle your video and microphone on and off. There is a chat function, so if you have questions, please type those in the chat. Make sure you hit that little paper airplane button in the bottom corner, and we will pause periodically throughout the presentation to answer questions. So really, anything on your mind, throw it in the chat. We're eager to get your feedback and happy to answer your questions. Today's agenda, we are going to first start with the Act 171 planning provisions, and we're going to take you through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development's 5-step town planning process. And then we'll look at some case studies from the town of Newfane and see how they're working with forest integrity and Act 171 in their town plan. Just a little bit about where Jens and I are coming from. At the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And that work takes us in a lot of different directions. We work on fish and wildlife, but we're increasingly working at the habitat level, the ecosystem level, and our work brings us into contact with all of the biodiversity here in Vermont. We serve all Vermonters, hunters, trappers, anglers, wildlife watchers, landowners, youth, and communities as well. And in particular, as staff for the Community Wildlife Program provide support for that planning process. And we offer our services free to towns and regional planning commissions. So that might be presentations or workshops like this webinar you're on today. We can help you with planning and mapping, connecting with the communities around you, understanding ecological concepts, and creating and interpreting resources for your particular situation or location. And back to 171. So this was a bill passed in 2016 that really came out of an understanding of the benefits of having large intact forests. And we're beginning to see fragmentation of our forest, or the breaking up and shrinking of our forest pattern here in the state. And these large forests in particular offer a host of benefits. They are critical reservoirs for biological diversity. They are scenic, of course. They filter our air and water and provide the basis for our working lands and forest industry here in Vermont. There are many benefits to having large forests for the recreation and tourism that are associated. They provide ecosystem services, preventing erosion, reducing flooding, and they are the primary lands for our hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing economy, which brings in just a huge amount of money to Vermont economy. There's a connection here with human health and habitat fragmentation and tick-borne illness. And increasingly, we're coming to understand the role that these large forests have in sequestering carbon from our environment. So, we really stand to benefit by protecting these large intact forests throughout Vermont. And it's not just an ecological issue. These large intact forests are powering our economy. Some of the numbers that are up on this slide are just staggering. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, and much of that is coming out of these large forest blocks. So just to give you an example for what we mean when we talk about fragmentation of large forest blocks, I want to show you a visual example from a location here in Vermont. So this is along the Waterbury and Stowe town line. And what we're looking at is an aerial image from 1962. And what we did was we went back to that image and we colored in everything that is forest. And so what you can see here, let me get my laser pointer up. What you can see here is that we have this large intact forest block here. There is a road that kind of cuts down through the west of this block. This is Vermont Route 100. But what I want to draw your attention to is not just this large forest block, but that the connection it has to other forest blocks to the north, to the east, and to some degree over here to the west. So this is 1962. And if we go back to that same location in 1974, what you can see is that we begin to have development occurring along the edges and into the interior of this forest block. By 1980, you can see there are a couple more roads heading up into the middle of that forest block. And by 1996, along all of those roads, we have residential development occurring. And so these little pockets have been cleared out of the interior of the forest. There's also development occurring down here in this patch. And if you look up here to the north, we're seeing the same issue occurring with those forest lands above. By 2007, that pattern has accelerated. And by 2011, we've ended up with a forest block that has been dramatically altered. You can see here that that connection from north to south has largely been severed. I mean, there are trees in there, but there isn't really a functional forest connection from north to south. Interestingly enough, there's, if you were to measure the spatial coverage of this forest, it's about the same, but the pattern has changed so dramatically. And that's something that we're increasingly worried about across Vermont. And if you were to look at aerial imagery of your community, no doubt you could find this trend occurring somewhere on your own regional landscape. So the planning work that comes out of Act 171 is aimed in large part at beginning to manage for what we call the ecologically functional landscape. In order to collect on the many benefits we get from large forests, we're going to need to be thinking about managing forest land in a very strategic way. And this will include having working forests. But any sort of land use planning decision that we make, we need to be considering what effect it will have on the pattern of forest on our landscape. So let's dig into some of the nuts and bolts of this Act 171. What is it? How did it come to be? And what do we need to do about it? Well, the first thing to know is that Act 171 amended the Vermont planning statute, and it added this provision in here to manage Vermont's forest lands so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. It requires town and regional plans to identify important areas of forest blocks and habitat connectors and plan for development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation. And this went into effect on January 1st of 2018. And because this is new language, at the state we're working to define and explain what exactly that means to towns and regional planning commissions. To be clear, one of the things that this requires is a map. So if you dig into the statute here, the plan has a variety of requirements, many of which are related to natural resources. And now for municipal plans that are adopted after January 1st, 2018 must include a map. And so if you look here in the language, we've highlighted just where that requirement is coming from. The land use plan, which shall consist of a map that includes, among other things, those forest blocks, wildlife habitat, and habitat connectors. Now that map can look like a couple different ways. It doesn't have to be totally cookie cutter, but to be clear, you do need a map at this point. So just a quick overview for folks who may not be super familiar with the planning process. We have these state planning goals, which intend to guide the local planning process and really serve as entry points into Act 171. So some of the relevant new language here at the state planning level relates to improving the quality of air, water, wildlife, forests, and other land resources. And then we also have this new language that, again, Vermont's forest land should be managed so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. So the idea here is that the state starts off the race with these goals, and then the local partners pick up the baton and implement it at the local level. So let's take a look at some of these different planning goals and see how they can serve as an entry point or a crosswalk into this forest integrity issue we're talking about here today. So in the state planning goals, you'll see this, a goal to have the historic settlement pattern of compact village and urban centers separated by rural countryside. Well, we want energy efficient transportation systems. We want to identify, protect, and preserve natural and historic features, maintain the quality of air, water, wildlife, and land, maintain and enhance recreational opportunities, strengthen our agricultural and forest industries, provide for the wise and efficient use of Vermont's natural resources, encourage flood resilient communities. These are really broad, getting at a number of issues. But what I want to highlight here is that each of these can provide a different entry point or opportunity to work on forest integrity. There are always going to be these crossover goals. And so as you get thinking about how you're going to go about complying with Act 171 and working to protect forest integrity, it doesn't need to materialize out of thin air. Chances are, if you have a plan, there are already related elements in there that can be strengthened, connected, or related to this issue of forest integrity and trying to prevent forest fragmentation. So for example, if your plan has a really well-developed flood resiliency section, well, there's a connection there between how large forest blocks can help prevent flooding. Similarly, if your town is a recreational mecca, we know that these large forest blocks may provide much of the basis for that recreation. So you can think creatively in terms of how you want to go about working on forest integrity. And again, here we want to just point out that we know there are a lot of required elements within a town plan. And so there are no rules on how many maps you have to include. You might already have a really well-developed natural resource map. And so if you want to, create an additional one that gets at these habitat blocks and forest blocks and habitat connectors, you are welcome to do that. And in fact, the language here in the requirements enables that, in that you can combine them or they can be separate. Okay, let's pause for questions.
Nothing in the chat, Andy.
Okay. Then we will keep going. And
it looks like Sabina just raised her hand. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks. That's probably easier than typing at this point. My question is, does using something existing like the ANR maps or biofinders, does that count as a map, or do we have to create our own that's specific to our town?
Well, there is certainly existing data that you can pull from BioFinder. However, we might we might recommend that rather than using it right out of the box, that you evaluate it at your town level. And so some towns, the entire town might be mapped as a forest block. So you may want to think about that and balance that with your planning goals. And Jens and I are available to help with that process, to really, get a map that's going to work for your community and protect that forest integrity. So you don't need to create the data out of thin air, but you might want to revise it, add to it, or subtract from it in some cases.
But in the case of Jericho, those contiguous habitat units are already quite excellent. You could just change the borders of them. But we can talk about it offline. Kathy Kingston has her hand raised, and then Renee, and then Susan. So let's go, Kathy.
Hi. Looking at the fragmentation issue, it seems like as long as we have zoning in our town that has 5-acre lots as permissible, it's going to encourage subdivisions, which do just that. And a lot of people come to Vermont and I imagine you'll address this at some point, but a lot of people come to Vermont to have a little space in the woods. These are very popular. And one of the things we thought about was the whole zoning. As long as people have the ability to divide, we're going to continue to have forest fragmentation problems unless we as towns start doing some more extreme zoning, saying that no, you got 50-acre zoning in this area, or something extreme perhaps. And I just wondered if you could address that issue at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That is certainly a challenge, and different communities will come at that from different ways. For some, a zoning solution might make the most sense. In other communities, we might look to other strategies as well, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. But I hear you that's a real challenge.
And I would just add that minimum lot zoning is perhaps not the way to go, and instead looking at density-based zoning might be a better way. But that's a bit of an aside. This presentation is really all about the town plan piece, and we won't get much into the regulations, but we're happy to work with you separately. Renee, you have your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, just a little note about what Kathy said. Springfield has 25 and 10-acre zoning as well. And we were worried about the big farms that were like 100 acres. And so we have a provision to allow them to do 1 2-acre lot, so like for a child, an adult child or something. But my question is about mapping. And I really like the maps that showed the progression over time. Is that something easy to do? And is that something that you help with, and is it free?
I believe that Jens, you did the work to get that historical imagery and color it in. Is that correct?
It is. And for those, I went to the state archives in Middlesex to get that 1941 flight and the 62 flight. Those aren't generally online. But elsewhere, it's really easy to go into Google Time Machine or whatever and look at the old historic photos. That's also possible on the A&R Atlas. But to go back to that 1940s flight, you need the paper photos, generally speaking. And some of those, it's kind of hit or miss whether they're online or not.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then last hand I see is Susan Smiley. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Surely it must be difficult to link in the plan promotion of recreation and forest activities, commercial forest activities, with the idea of protecting forests from fragmentation. I mean, I'm sure that you have thought of it and there are strategies, but I look forward to hearing them.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Susan. There certainly can be a tension there. But what we're really thinking about is this ecologically functional landscape. And so we understand that there are going to be a variety of activities occurring within these forest blocks. And so the goal really is to make sure that that activity is compatible with ecological function. And so if you're thinking about recreation, you might be looking at the design of the recreation, or the type of the recreation, or the seasonality of it. It certainly is a challenge, but inherently incompatible. So I think at this point we'll pause on the questions. These are great. Please keep them coming, and we'll take another break at the next section to address what's on folks' minds. Okay, so in this next section, we do want to acknowledge that we understand that at the town level, you have this challenging job of balancing all these different community values. We want these healthy forests, we want a healthy economy, we want a healthy community, but we believe really strongly from the state perspective that without having that healthy forest, we're going to be hard pressed to keep that balance and have healthy economies and have healthy communities. So one of the ways that you can work on going through this balancing act in dealing with forest integrity is to go through this 5-step process that's laid out in the state planning manual. And we're going to walk you through those 5 steps that are an iterative planning process. And so the takeaway here is that Act 171 is really nothing new. It just puts a finer point on how the forest planning will fit into the overall planning process. And if you're not familiar with this resource, I'd encourage you to check it out. There's also a section in there about working with existing plans, because we know that most of you are not likely creating a plan from scratch. So the bulk of our work comes in the first step of this 5-step planning process. And that's the community assessment. And so here we want to assess what's going on in our community with forest integrity. And one of the best places you can access data for this is from BioFinder. So if you go into your web browser and type in biofinder.vermont.gov, it'll bring you to our one-stop shop for getting ecological data that you can use in your town plan. One of the data sets that you will find in BioFinder is this forest block data set. And we went through a mapping exercise to map all of the forest blocks in Vermont that were 20 acres or larger, surrounded by development and roads. And we came up with this data set of 4,052 forest blocks in the state of Vermont. And you can see here that in this image of these forest blocks, we've color-coded them by size. And the largest blocks are, no surprise, up in the Northeast Kingdom and along the spine of the Green Mountains. As you get down into the valleys, we do still have forest blocks, but they tend to be smaller. And so this data set is important to know about because it's the foundational data set we've used in BioFinder to develop additional priority-based data sets that you can use as well. So look, if we zoom into our case study town today of Newfane, what you can see is that most of the town is covered by one habitat block or another. And you can see here that we have a couple large habitat blocks that are along the Newfane town border. Here's a 6,000 acre, here's a 7,000 acre. And then throughout the interior of the town, there are these 500 to 1,000 or 1,500 acre blocks. So this is what Newfane looks like, and you can zoom into your town and see what kinds of habitat blocks we've mapped there. Now, from that forest block data set, we created this other data product called the interior forest blocks data set. And these are the deep, dark woods. You walk in, you hear a wood thrush singing. And we took a sub-selection of the forest blocks and ranked them into what we would consider the highest priority interior forest blocks, and then priority interior forest blocks. So the highest priority, these are the ones that we know are critically important at the statewide level. The priority blocks, we know those are important, but we don't really have enough data to say that they're that top tier priority. And so you can see here in this part of the state around Newfane, we have this huge block of highest priority interior forest along the Green Mountains. And then we also have some of it over here from Marlborough stretching up into these other towns to the north. If we zoom into Newfane, again, you can see that not all of those habitat blocks made the cut to be considered interior forest blocks. We still have these large ones here along the northwest as highest priority, but we've some of those habitat blocks in the interior of town just didn't make the cut. So this data set is useful to know about because it can be a starting point in addition with the forest blocks data set for identifying which of those blocks in your community provide that interior ecological condition. Now, there's another related data set that you'll find in BioFinder I want to share with you, and it's this connectivity blocks data set. So again, here we took a selection of those forest habitat blocks and did a subset of them that was based on their degree of connectedness. And so here we weren't just totally concerned with interior forest condition. We wanted to see, well, how well did this block connect to these other blocks in the region? And collectively, that data set of connectivity blocks shows us what a connected network of habitat in Vermont looks like. And so here, if you look at Newfane, you can see that Newfane is in this really interesting position where it has these habitat blocks throughout town, but it's part of this regional connectivity pathway here from the southern Vermont moving up north, but also from the Connecticut River Valley moving east to west over to the Green Mountains. So Newfane is interesting in that it sits at this crossroad of connected habitat in southern Vermont. And that's an important thing to know for the town of Newfane, in that the actions they take to maintain forest integrity, the effects will radiate beyond their town. So this is another great data set you can use to look at the different forest blocks in your town and understand their relative value, both within the town and as it relates to the larger region. Okay, here's just a zoom up here. This is what the connectivity blocks look like close up. Again, I think it's helpful to keep that zoomed out perspective with this data set because you can see that pattern. And just briefly from our place at Vermont Fish and Wildlife, this is a big deal for many of our key species like bear, moose, bobcat, and river otter. They need this connected network of habitat to move across the landscape. And so if these species are important in your community, which very likely they are, retaining them on the landscape is going to require that concerted effort to protect forest integrity. Just to give you a quick example for what that might look like, here's a couple data points from a collared bobcat. The main thing I want to show you here is that this bobcat is spending the bulk of its time in forest habitat, wetland habitat, but it's also moving across the landscape to access this habitat block, to move from this habitat block to this one here on the right. So these connectors are a big deal. And to hit that home, I want to just show you another landscape and what these forest blocks and habitat connectors will do for wildlife on the landscape. So here's another landscape in Vermont. And if I color in all of the blocks that are big enough and intact enough to be considered a forest block, this is what I get. There's also this slightly smaller habitat block here in the center of the image. And so if we're thinking about retaining connectivity between this habitat, we're going to need some of these stepping stones or habitat connectors to create a continuous pathway of habitat across this landscape. I'll also point out here that there's a neat sort of river and lake system here that could provide another habitat connector. So this is going to look different in each community, but this is kind of one example of what we're getting at when we require planning for forest blocks and habitat connectors. Just a quick note here, there's another data set in BioFinder that relates to the surface waters and riparian areas. So these are the habitat around our waters. And you can see here in Newfane, there's a huge network of streams and rivers. This can also be connecting habitat, this river network and riparian network that glues together the forested landscape. One other data set you'll find in BioFinder is this wildlife road crossings. This is a model-based data set. So we looked at structural elements on the landscape, where is there forest cover or wetland cover next to a road, and use that to predict where we think wildlife are most likely to cross the road. Keep in mind, this is model-based. It hasn't been ground truthed or field checked. So we don't recommend using it right out of the box in your town plan. But it's a good starting place. You might look at what areas are mapped in your town and say, hey, we need to investigate these modeled habitat connectors over the next 8 years and get a handle on which ones are actually being used by wildlife. So just to wrap up this section of community assessment using BioFinder, you can dig into all these different layers that I've highlighted: the interior forest blocks, the connectivity blocks, the surface water and riparian areas, and the wildlife road crossings. But you can also turn on this layer called the overall priority rank. And it's kind of a one-stop shop that takes all those different data layers and meshes them together into an overall top priority, highest priority, and priority. And so if you were to go back to Newfane and turn that layer on, what you'd see is that Newfane is overwhelmingly mapped as highest priority. And what that really means is that all of the planning actions that occur in BioFinder matter quite a deal to both Newfane and the greater ecology of the state. So there's a huge opportunity to make a really significant positive impact simply by planning for forest integrity. Now, just if we begin to dive into the Newfane town plan, I went right to the mapping section, and this map here from 2018 has a lot of excellent elements. It's got rare, threatened, and endangered species data. It's got deer wintering area. But what it doesn't have is those forest blocks and habitat connectors. So while this is a good map in many ways, it's missing that requirement to map those Act 171 elements of forest blocks and habitat connectors. And as we move into the next section, Jens is going to take us through some different elements of Newfane's town plan. All right, have any questions come up so far?
Nothing in the chat, Andy. Folks can feel free to raise their hands or unmute their mics. Susan, go ahead. Susan, go ahead. Can you unmute yourself?
What are the bases in your judgment of highest priority blocks for that, what are you thinking of when you kind of apply that term? What makes it highest priority?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Something with my sound cut out there.
Okay. In judging the highest priority interior blocks, what are the elements that compose the judgment about highest priority?
So, with the interior forest blocks, what we're really selecting for are large forest blocks that have this ratio of interior habitat to edge habitat. So, the larger the block, the more interior we have relative to its edge. The edge is, we have often issues associated with edges of these forest blocks. We might have more invasives. The habitat might decline for some of our songbird species. So we've chosen the blocks that sort of best represent our best interior forest condition throughout the state.
Thank you.
And just one other note there is that, this analysis was done from a statewide perspective. So just keep that in mind that, we're looking across the state and not, doing it at a precise town-wide level.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
well.
Kingston, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh,
one more
yep.
hand.
Yeah, I was just, hi, I'm just wondering if, I'm thinking about Route 91 and crossing over into New Hampshire. Is there any, is that something you're going to address here? Just thoughts on that. Our town is right along the Connecticut River, and just wondering what you have to say about that.
Your sound cut out there for a sec. So is the question, how does I-91 fit into connectivity?
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering how we can even address Route 91, and are there any long-term plans or thoughts on how to deal with animals moving east to west?
Sure.
Over
certainly
that barrier.
these larger highways can be barriers to movement. And so, there are likely places along that interstate where wildlife can cross under through, bridges and culverts. So, you might be, it could be worthwhile to, figure out where those locations are and factor that into your decision making about habitat connectivity. But yeah, that is indeed a challenge.
Andy, if I may, I would just add to that the current standard for what VTrans is building is pretty good for wildlife. It's 1.1 times bank full. And so they might replace a 3-foot bridge with a 12-foot, a 3-foot culvert with a 12-foot, 20-foot bridge. You have massive improvements. It's just a question of getting enough money to be able to replace the culverts as they come in. VTrans gets about 60% of the funding it needs to maintain the infrastructure it has. So we're only going to be replacing the bridges that are about to break, and not just because of wildlife concerns, but there sure is an opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, given the time, I don't want to cut folks off if there are more questions, but let's hold, and I'm going to turn things over to Jens. And if you accumulate more questions, we'll make sure to get to them at the very end.
And Andy, you're seeing my screen, yes?
I think I'm still on mine.
Are you folks seeing step 2 right now?
Oh yeah, I see it now, Jens.
Great,
Go ahead.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thanks, Andy. And so we were starting on this 5-step process that's in the ACCD planning manual. And the step that Andy just went through was step 1, the assessment of what do you have? And for our purposes, that what do you have was really about those ecological resources and the mapping that's available. So step 2 of this process is to develop a shared community vision. And certainly this sounds very easy and is much more difficult than that with all of the different things that we're trying to plan for. But I put Richmond's vision statement up on the screen just to give you a sense of what that could look like. And the types of attributes that calls out, you know, authentic Vermont character is in here, rural character is in here, close-knit community is in here. So there are a variety of phrases that Richmond is using to try and capture what its vision for the future is. Another way of getting at this community vision is a tool called community value mapping. And that's not just asking what the values are in the community, but what the values are where. So here's an example from Cornwall, Vermont, of community value mapping activity we did, I think, 2 years ago. And first we did it in the in the elementary school and got grades kindergarten through 5 involved in drawing on these maps. And then we did it again for the adults the following week. And we just asked, what do you love about living here? And they drew circles. I love the quiet here. I love the scenic view over this hill. I love to recreate there. So each of the individual responses were put together into value groups like historic, scenic, recreation. And I added all of those responses together. And so I made maps. You can see them around the edge here. I made maps for each of those different value groups. But then I overlapped those different value groups. And that's the map you see here, where there are the most community values overlapping. And you'll see here in Cornwall Swamp, there's a tremendous amount of overlap: hunting and fishing interests, wildlife interests, recreation, scenic. There are a variety of different interests that come to play in this part of Cornwall. So with this value mapping activity, the Cornwall Conservation Commission was able to overlap these community value maps with their ecological priorities. This is a inventory done by Brett Engstrom in 2014 showing ecologically significant sites. And you can see how much overlap there is with Cornwall Swamp and some of these other areas across town that are ecologically important. You can also see a couple places that are ecologically important that don't show up as particularly important community values. So those are opportunities to do more education. So for Cornwall, I had the Conservation Commission write up names of organizations and individuals that represent each of these values. And so they literally have a list of potential allies when they want to work on conservation in these areas, other parts of town, other values and value groups that are represented, and the people or institutions that are a part of those values. So there's a tremendous opportunity for working together in partnership to address these places of overlap with community values and ecological priorities. Now, step 3 is all about identifying goals and objectives. And I want to zoom in here a little bit more. So the first step here is just, well, review the existing plan. Okay, assess how well it does at the planning goals, addressing the planning goals, and the community and regional goals. Okay, great. So there's a lot in there. We know that. And just a reminder that this new language about forest land should be managed so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. So that's a goal, statewide goal, that we'll want to bring in to our community goals and see how that manifests. So then the next step is to update those goals with new goals to help achieve the purpose of the state planning goals or the other goals that you've written. So here are some examples for Act 171. You could have a goal of maintain and improve the ecological integrity of intact forest blocks, or maintain and improve the ecological integrity and functionality of habitat connectors. Those are the types of goals that you might write in to specifically address some of these Act 171 issues. So those are just 2 more steps to this overall, the overall process. Next, we're going to dive in a lot more to the next section of the 5-step process and also to a case study. Any questions or comments come up so far about those steps 2 and 3?
Kathy just had a quick question about minimum forest block size.
What is the minimum forest block size?
Yeah.
Depends on the town. we don't want to be in the business of comparing a Green Mountain, forest blocks in the Green Mountains to forest blocks in the Champlain Valley, because they're different. But the minimum unit, the minimum size that we map is 20 acres. We won't do a forest block smaller than 20 acres. But that said, a completely isolated forest block that's 20 acres probably is actually a patch of trees rather than a forest, if you understand my difference ecologically. So that would be the minimum area is 20. Anything else, Andy?
Linda is asking, is there a list of sample goals to adapt for our town plan?
Yes. Yes, there are several places for that. And I'll show you a resource at the end called Community Strategies. It's a VNRC publication you could use. There are also some sample goals in Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage, but that's old. But Linda, I will help you with those sample goals offline. Anything else?
That's it in the chat right now. Oh no, sorry, we've got some hands up. Michael?
Yes, I'm wondering, I've done some of these community events where people come and choose and select, things to help develop a community vision. Any ideas for how to do that with the pandemic kind of restricting community members getting together as a group?
Michael, just this week I did a community value mapping, or excuse me, last week I did a community value mapping effort for Moncton, and we did it all online using Zoom and an online whiteboard called Miro. So there certainly are online techniques for getting that community value information, even in the middle of a pandemic. I'd rather have a potluck and see people in person, but without that, this was a good enough second option.
Mm-hmm. Did you oversee or kind of host that? How was that organized?
I did. I facilitated it. I did the work on Miro. The Town Conservation Commission hosted it and did all of the work getting people there. Okay. But we worked very closely together, and I facilitated it and did the mapping stuff.
Okay. Is that something that you would be able to do for other towns in this near future?
Of course, would be happy to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Calling from Tunbridge, is that right?
No, I'm from Woodbury.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'd love to go in Woodbury. I need to respond to you all with an email anyway.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Anything else?
We got one more from Soroya.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention regarding the proposed language for policies and all of that there was a group working together from Dover, Marlborough, Westminster, and Guilford. I don't think Newfane was part of it, but maybe. That was kind of going over existing policies from different towns and pulling good language. And Margot Gia was part of that. So we kind of were trying to help narrow things down or give people a place to start from. So that I think will be available also.
Yes, that's the Wyndham Connectivity Collaborative.
Yeah.
And it's run out of the Wyndham Regional Planning Commission. They are actually meeting this minute. I'm supposed to be on that call. But yes, I can connect you with their work as well. All right, I'm just going to keep going in the interest of time, but please keep those questions coming. We love them. And I just wanted to hit this step 4, this map out the future step 4, and make the point that it's not just planning for where we don't want development. We also want to plan for where we do want development, and both sides of that coin are terribly important. And so what I have up on screen is the Vermont Planning Atlas. It gives you some idea of the designations, the village designations, the downtown designations, and some of the other information about your town plan and about your regulatory framework. So the planning atlas is a great way to go. And I have Newfane up on screen, and I just wanted to point out that Newfane has identified 3 different village centers and had those designated. So they do have a clear idea of where they want some of that development. So that's an important step. So step 5 in this process is how to make it happen. And so I'm going to start here with their existing land use map in the town plan, just to give you a sense about Newfane. And again, they have 3 village centers. We just saw those, South Newfane, Williamsville, and Newfane. There's a significant amount of UVA land, use value appraisal, the current use program. And so we can see a lot of the landowners in town are managing their land to be maintained as forest or farm. And then I just wanted to remind us all about these maps that Andy had shown in terms of these ecological priorities. So let's just jump into the Newfane town plan. And so I brought up the table of contents, and I just wanted to show you how exhaustive this town is in terms of speaking to these issues. I pulled some topics from the natural resource section. There's a separate forest resource section and a scenic resource section. So there are quite a lot of places in the town plan, or quite a lot of text in the town plan that speaks to these issues. And of course, we want to remind you all to make sure issues like this get into a variety of different parts of the town plan, not just the natural resource section, transportation section, and land use section are 2. So here in the Newfane town plan in July 2018, there's a wildlife resource section. And it starts out with perhaps the greatest threat to Newfane's significant upland wildlife species is the gradual process of parcelization, taking bigger parcels and dividing them up into smaller and smaller lots. So that's how it starts, is calling out this process of parcelization as a problem. Then the town plan has a variety of of policies in this wildlife resource and natural features section about avoiding fragmentation of large blocks, protecting bear habitat, protect and preserve rare and endangered plants, animals, and natural communities. Great, so there's some good policies there. There are also specific recommendations to follow up on those policies. Like first, they need to obtain information, and second, they want to protect habitat through the development of land use regs. So they said in their town plan that they want to develop land use regs that are sensitive to valuable habitats. Awesome. Okay. Next piece of the town plan. In the natural resource sections on the forest resources piece, they talk about major asset to the town. They talk about all of these different values. And this is important because they're not treating forests as simply an ecological piece, but also incorporating these cultural values. That is critically important. I've been doing some Act 171 work in Lowell, and they're very focused on private property rights. And so this is not going to translate into regulation, but the idea of defining forests in this really broad sense really hit home for Lowell as well as here in Newfane. So I just wanted to express how important it is to speak to these larger human values as well as ecological values. Okay, so then I'm going to keep going. They look at forest blocks and they take it to the next level, and they say a look at the larger pattern shows our forests are being fragmented by sprawl. And in turn, we lose the corresponding and significant contributions that forestry makes to our economy and culture because of that sprawl. So they're not just looking at the blocks and saying how important the blocks are. They then take an even larger step and say, look at the pattern of our blocks and how they're threatened by sprawl. And so here's some more. I just pulled out some of that text. A healthy forest pattern is one where a town's largest forest blocks connect to one another via smaller forest blocks and riparian areas. So they've handled the blocks themselves, and now they're handling the larger pattern that they want among their blocks. Then now they're diving into connectors and what a connector is, and then lastly, they bring it all together with this. An ecologically functional landscape is especially important in the context of climate change. So in the context of this plan, they took the blocks and explained why they're important for all of these different values. They looked at the connections. Why are they important? Then they went up to pattern across the whole town. And now they're expressing that pattern as ecologically functional landscape that they need to maintain into the future. They lifted this entire chart from Agency of Natural Resources guidance document on Act 171. All of these different ecological benefits and cultural benefits of maintaining forest blocks and connectors. So again, they're further justifying why this is important for all of these different reasons. Here in the forest resource policies, they want to direct growth, so not to negatively impact valuable forests, protect, encourage, avoid fragmentation. They've got a lot to say here in the policies on how they're going to make this happen. And then again, they come back to this implement land use regulations. And in this case, they want to do it to allow for cluster development outside of the forest blocks. Lastly, I just wanted to bring up that it's not just the natural resource section. There are two pieces, two policies here in the scenic resource sections that are important, that are relevant. And so I want to make sure that we include information like this in several different parts of the town plan. Gosh, if only I could spell. Sorry about that. Okay. So here's the proposed land use map that's in the town plan. And I want to point out that in this proposed land use map, they have a resource district, that's the RS in town, and those are characterized by the presence of important wildlife habitat and large blocks of unfragmented forest. Okay. Then they have this rural district, and that's where which are already committed to development, easily accessible from the existing road. So look at that pattern for what they're proposing, right? They're keeping an intact block here, one here and one here, but they have allowed for sprawl. Let me show you this a different way. Remember this map that Andy hammered on? And the east-west connectivity and north-south connectivity that's so important in town, that's not present here in this land use plan, in the proposed land use. So I'm worried about this area and that area and that area and that area. Even though their proposed land use plan calls for, or proposed land use calls for getting rid of those connections, their current zoning does maintain those connections. So the resource zone in their zoning does go through here, and so it does offer more protections. But I just wanted to call out this tension between the proposed land use and the ecological attributes. The direction they say they want to head is not one that maintains a pattern of connectivity into the future. So there's excellent language in here, but it hasn't quite made it all the way into what their vision of the future is. So this is another place where Newfane could really continue to do better, is to address how these changes might affect their proposed land use map. Okay, I know I'm out of time here. Just wanted to review. There are several different resources available to you. I had mentioned Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage earlier. That's a 2004 publication. This is really going to explain the parts like interior forest and connectivity blocks that Andy started out with. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is going to explain how to use BioFinder for land use planning. And then this is the document I had talked about earlier, the Vermont Natural Resources Council document. And this really deals with the tools, the planning regulatory and non-regulatory planning tools with a chapter on each one. So they'll have a separate chapter on traditional zoning districts, on overlay districts, on all of that. So that's a great resource as well. And then Andy and I continue to be available to you to help in any way that we can. We're anxious to work one-on-one with your towns or in groups. Please let us know how we can be helpful. So with that, I apologize for running a couple minutes late. Are there any other questions for those of us who can stay on?
Just a quick note here that I put links to all of those documents Jens was mentioning in the chat, and you can get them all as online PDFs. And Renee is asking, what issues are there with solar fields and connectivity?
That's a great question, Renee. In some places, solar fields are problematic because the companies are fencing around the outside of the field. So the location matters a great deal. Bear in mind, they do not legally have to fence around the field. The only thing they have to do legally is cover the backs of the panels so no one can rip electronics out. But they tend to fence around the outside, and then it becomes a connectivity issue. So, you know, we've worked with a proposal in Brandon on how to realign the fencing to allow for wildlife movement, to make it, essentially make it into smaller chunks of solar field with corridors in between, fenced corridors.
C Commission has their hand up. I'm not sure who that is, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's me. In Heartland, we don't have any zoning. And so I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how we can manage land use without being able to tell people you can build here, you can't build here, you can't do this.
Well, you will know the politics of Heartland better than I do. And so in terms of which tool, you know, I would proceed carefully there. And, you know, what matters more is that the tool is right for the community at this point. But, you know, subdivision is one that you could consider. It's not a zoning district, but it still does define how, or the process by which people can take bigger parcels and divide them into smaller and smaller parcels. And so you might get more bang for your buck by looking at subdivision process than trying to get into zoning at all.
Good, thanks.
And you're in Two Rivers, right?
Yes.
You know, the RPCs, there are a couple of RPC staffers on this, not from Two Rivers, but there are a couple of RPC staffers on this webinar, and they're such a great source of information. And I would really encourage you to work with Two Rivers on that.
Yeah, we are working with them.
Yeah.
So Sabina writes in that in Jericho, they have a solar field cutting off habitat. And Alice is asking, how do power company distribution and transmission lines impact connectivity, positive and or negative?
Well, thanks for saying positive and or negative, because it is much more complicated. For some species like bear, we actually see a lot of bear use on power line right-of-ways. And in that case, and bobcats will do that too, where they will use them for connectivity. So for bear, you'll see, you know, the creosote on the telephone poles in the middle of a right-of-way. You'll often see those marked by bear. And so they're not a fragmenting feature in the way that a road is for many species. Of course, for deep forest species that are very sensitive to the structure, like the height, I'm talking about bird species here, it would be seen as a fragmenting feature, but that's not true across the board. So for our purposes, we do not consider them fragmenting features.
That's all I'm seeing in the chat, but folks are welcome to go ahead and ask questions. I know we're a couple minutes over here, so if you need to drop off, by all means do so. We're happy to stay on for those who wish to.
I just want to say this has been a really great presentation. I'm in the Westminster Planning Commission, and I really, really appreciate this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're happy to work with your town one-on-one. We'd love to. So let us know how we can help.
One other one here, Jens. Sabina's asking, any advice on language regarding length of driveways?
Yeah, let's make them shorter. There's a great Enosburg did a driveway. No. Montgomery. Sorry, Montgomery, Vermont did a driveway ordinance that as an anti-forest fragmentation policy that we can look up. Sabina, Charlie Hancock from the select board there in Montgomery got that through, and I'll unearth that. But that's a great one. And there used to be a road rule in Act 250. And finding that language might also be helpful. All right. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for sticking with us this morning. We really appreciate you being here. And we're really happy to help your town in any way that we can. So please let us know.